pregnant and sold twice in 1 month at 3/4. A cowboy was the buyer who stayed and gave her vows. The rifle was cold when I picked it up. That's the thing I remember first, not the smell of the place, not the sound of the man behind the table counting his money, not even her face. The cold of that Winchester stock against my palm, and how I set it back down without firing it, because I knew if I pulled the trigger I'd spend the rest of my life on the wrong side of a rope. I want to be straight about what I was before all this. Not a saint, not a man who went around rescuing people. I was 43 years old. I had a string of 7 horses, a bedroll, and a contract to deliver breeding stock to a settlement north of the Milk River before the first hard freeze. That was my life. A route, a purpose, not a complicated one, but mine. Coulter's Fort wasn't even on my route. I came to it because one of my mares threw a shoe 2 days west of there, and I needed a farrier. Just that. A thrown shoe on a roan mare named Cressa, and I ended up in a place I'd never set foot before and never intended to. The fort wasn't much. A trading post with a name bigger than its ambitions. A scatter of outbuildings and a kind of muddy yard between them where men stood around doing the particular nothing that men do when they're between things. There was a pole corral on the north side, a low-roofed building that sold whiskey and called itself a tavern, and a wide plank table set up under a canvas linta that a man named Ordell used for transactions of various kinds. I didn't know his name then. I found it out later, in the way you find things out about men who do what he did. I came into the yard looking for the farrier, and I heard a voice, a woman's voice, low and strained, saying something I couldn't make out. Then Ordell's voice over it, the kind of voice a man uses when he's decided something and isn't interested in any other version of events. I stopped walking. There were 6 or 7 men standing in a loose half-circle around that table, and what was on the other side of it was a young woman. Dark hair, pale now from whatever had brought her to this place. She was with child, well along, I'd say 7 months, maybe closer to 8. She had a carpet bag at her feet, and she was holding the handle of it with both hands, the way a person holds onto the one thing they haven't lost yet. Ordell was selling her. I want you to understand what I mean by that, because the word sounds like one thing and the reality is something else, something worse and more ordinary at the same time. He wasn't calling it selling. He was calling it a contracted arrangement for transportation and provision. A man could pay a fee, and the woman would travel with him and cook and keep his camp. The fee was $30. The woman had no say that I could see in any part of this. She was shaking her head at something, and Ordell wasn't listening to the shaking of her head. I stood there for a moment. A man named Griggs, heavyset, wore a cavalry hat with the brim bent wrong. He was the one who stepped forward first. He had $30. He counted it out on the table while she stood there watching him count it, and then Ordell pushed her carpet bag toward her with the toe of his boot, meaning she should pick it up and follow Griggs. She picked it up. I don't know exactly what happened inside me in that moment. It wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't a vision. It was something quieter and more certain than that. The understanding that if I walked away from this yard and kept going north with my string of horses, I would carry the memory of that woman picking up her carpet bag for the rest of my life, and it would not sit well. I called out. I said, and this is close to the exact words, that arrangement's not concluded yet. Griggs turned around. Ordell looked up. The other men shifted in that lazy, interested way men shift when something might become violent. I walked up to the table. I put $40 on it. I said I was offering $40 for the arrangement, and if Ordell was running a fair transaction, he'd take the higher bid. Ordell looked at the money. He looked at Griggs. He looked at me. He took the $40. Griggs didn't like it. He made noise about it for a minute or two, the kind of noise a man makes when he knows he doesn't have a real argument but wants to seem like he might. I waited him out. He left. The woman was looking at me. I didn't say anything to her right away. I turned back to Ordell and I told him I wanted to be clear about something. I said whatever he thought he'd arranged, he was wrong. The woman was traveling with me as a free person, not as a bought thing, and if I heard he'd done this again with anyone, I'd be coming back to have a longer conversation with him about it. I said this quietly. I wasn't performing for the yard. I meant it. Ordell just looked at me the way men like him always look, like he's already calculating the next arrangement. I picked up her carpet bag, and I walked toward the gate of the yard. After a moment, I heard her footsteps behind me. I found the farrier. I got Cressa shod. The woman, her name was Nell. I found that out later, too. She sat on a barrel outside the farrier's shed and watched me work with the horses, checking their feet and their withers, tightening the pack straps I'd loosened when I stopped. She didn't speak. I didn't either. There was nothing to say yet. When the farrier was done and I'd paid him, I brought Nell a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried venison from my saddlebag. She ate it without looking at me. Her hands were still shaking a little, I noticed. Not badly. The way a person shakes after something frightening, when the frightening part is over but the body hasn't gotten the news yet. We made camp about 4 miles from the fort, in a cottonwood draw where there was water. I put up the oilskin lean-to I used in rainy weather and I set her bedroll under it. I told her she could sleep, that I'd take first watch. She asked me, and this was the first thing she said to me, her voice low and careful. She asked me what I wanted from her. I told her nothing. I told her I had a contract to deliver horses north before freeze-up, and she was welcome to travel with me until we reached the settlement, where there were people and a doctor, and she could make whatever arrangements suited her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The last man who told me nothing wanted the most." I thought about that. I said, "I know I'm not him." She didn't answer, but she lay down on the bedroll, and after a while I heard her breathing change the way it does when a person finally sleeps. I sat up with the fire low and the horses quiet on the picket line and the stars the way they get out there, not pretty, not poetic, just enormous. Too many to count, too far away to care. I sat there and thought about what I'd done and whether I was equal to it, and I didn't arrive at any comfortable answer. That was how it started. Her name was full, Cornelia Vass. She'd been called Nell since she was a child, growing up on a farm in eastern Kansas. Her father had been a decent man and her mother a hard-working one, and she'd married at 22, which is the right age to marry if the man is good and the wrong age to marry if he isn't. Her husband, a man named Delacroix, was not good. I'm not going to spend much time on what he was, because this story isn't about him and I refuse to give him more of my words than he deserves. What I'll say is this: he sold her. When she was 6 months pregnant with their child, he sold her to a man named Burchard for $50 and 2 mules, and then left the territory. She didn't learn the details of the transaction until she was already 300 miles from anything she knew. Burchard was better than Delacroix in the way that a stone floor is better than a pit, harder, but at least solid. He didn't treat her badly. He was simply indifferent to her in the way some men are indifferent to everything that doesn't have a use to them in this exact moment. He ran a supply operation between forts, and he brought her along the way he brought the other cargo. And when the route took him past Ordell's place and Ordell showed interest, Burchard sold her again for $35 and a case of rifle shells. That was the second time, 1 month between the first and second. The carpet bag was the same one she'd carried out of Kansas. She told me all this over about 4 days of travel. Not in order, not in a rush, pieces of it when something reminded her of another piece. The way people tell things when they're deciding if you're safe to tell things to. I listened. I didn't ask questions that weren't mine to ask. When she ran out of words, I didn't fill the silence, because some silences want filling and some silences are the thing itself. I'll tell you what Nell Vass was, because you need to know it to understand the rest. She was 25 years old and she'd been used badly by 2 men in the span of a month, and she was 8 months pregnant on the plains, and she still had a quality to her that I can only describe as upright. Not stiff, not brittle, upright. She looked at things directly. She answered questions plain. When I made a mistake, the second morning, I set up the linta with the slope going the wrong direction and it pooled overnight. She told me so without softening it, just said, "You've got it backwards," and showed me the better way without making me feel a fool about it. She knew things. She'd been on the move for a month and she'd paid attention. She had a strength in her that those 2 men had not managed to break, and that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, an enormous thing. I noticed it, I didn't say so. On the 5th day, she asked me about the horses. Not to make conversation, she'd wait out silence as long as it needed to go, but because she was genuinely curious. She wanted to know why I kept the roans separate from the others at picket, whether it was temperament or just her habit with new horses. I told her it was both, that Cressa was particular about who she stood next to the first week, and would work herself into a lather trying to move away from a horse she didn't trust, so it saved trouble to give her space until she'd made up her mind. Nell listened to this seriously, the way she listened to everything, and then she said, "She sounds like a sensible animal." I said she was. Nell said I'd like to learn more about them. Horses. I grew up with farm horses but not working ones. So I taught her. Over the next 3 days of trail, I told her what I knew, how to read the ear set, what the weight distribution tells you when a horse shifts, which sounds mean attention and which mean fear, how to approach from the left without startling. She paid close attention, asked smart questions, remembered what she was told. By the time we were a day from the Milk River, she could read Cressa's mood better than some men who'd worked horses for years. She was 30 feet ahead of me one afternoon, riding the bay, and she stopped and turned back and said, "Your roan's favoring her left fore again." I hadn't seen it. I came up alongside Cressa and checked her, and she was right, not the shoe this time, a small stone lodged in the frog that hadn't been there at noon. I got it out in 2 minutes. Cressa stamped once and went sound. I looked at Nell. She looked back at me without making a thing of it. I said, "Good eye." She said, "You taught me what to look for." Which was true and also wasn't the whole of it. The looking was her own. We were 4 days out from Coulter's fort, making decent time up the valley, when we ran into trouble of a different kind. There were 3 of them. They came off the ridge to the east on good horses, which told me they'd been watching us for at least part of the morning. They had that particular easy way of riding that means men who are used to taking what they want. The one in front was tall with a red beard, and he wore 2 pistols. I pulled the string up and stopped, and I put Nell behind me. Not by touching her. I hadn't touched her since the yard, hadn't so much as brushed her arm, but by moving my horse back and to the left so that she was on my offside, sheltered. The red-bearded man made friendly noises. He said he was lost. Could I tell him the way to the Sweetwater? I told him I didn't know any Sweetwater in this country, which was true. He said that was a shame, and then he said he'd noticed I was traveling with a woman. I said nothing. He said a woman that far out on the trail must be looking for a better situation, and he thought he and his partners could offer one. I said nothing still. I had my right hand resting on my thigh about 4 inches from the grip of my Colt, and I was watching all 3 of them at once, which is something you learn to do. He said it again, a little less friendly. I said, "The woman is not available for conversation." He asked me who I thought I was to be making that decision. I said, "I'm the man who'll still be sitting this horse after you 3 are done figuring that out." There was a pause that lasted about as long as it takes a man to decide if he's willing to be shot over something. The red-bearded man measured me. I let him measure. Whatever he read in me, I don't know what it was, but I know what I was feeling, which was nothing theatrical, just a cold, settled certainty that I was not moving and he was not having her. Whatever he read, he decided it wasn't worth it. He turned his horse. The other 2 followed. They went back up the ridge and over it. I sat there until they were gone. Sat there another 5 minutes after that, listening. Then I let out a long breath, and I turned to look at Nell. She was watching me, not scared the way I expected. "Something else?" She said, "You didn't flinch." I said, "Not a lot of percentage in flinching." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." That was my name, Drew Calloway. I said she was welcome and clicked Cressa forward, and we went on. I should tell you something about carrying responsibility for another person when you've been alone a long time. I'd been alone 9 years. Not entirely, there's always men on the trail, always camps shared, contracts worked alongside other hands. But alone in the way I mean, no one waiting for me, no one whose cold or hunger or fear was mine to fix. My decisions went only as far as my own skin. That's a particular kind of freedom that becomes a particular kind of emptiness, and you stop noticing the emptiness after a while. It's just the weather. Having Nell in my camp changed the weather. Not because she was helpless, she wasn't. She did her portion of everything without being asked. When I built the fire, she had the coffee going. When I saddled the horses, she was already tightening her own cinch on the bay gelding I'd given her to ride. She was better at skinning the rabbits I brought in than I was, faster and cleaner, and she did it without a word about it being unpleasant work. She was capable. But there was a weight to it now, an accountability. If those 3 men had come over the ridge and things had gone differently, I'd have had to answer for her. That weight, that having to answer for, I had forgotten what it felt like. Not bad, just heavy. The kind of heavy that tells you you're carrying something real. At night she slept on her side, her back to the fire, and sometimes I'd see her hand move to her belly in her sleep. Not a conscious thing, just a reaching. The baby was active. She'd tell me sometimes, matter-of-factly, that it had been kicking all morning or that it had been quiet since noon and she was watching for it. I didn't know much about babies. I listened like it was useful information. One night, it was the 7th night, we were 2 days from the Milk River settlement. I woke up and the fire was low and she was sitting up. Not in distress, just sitting, her hand on her belly. I asked if something was wrong. She said no. She said she just couldn't sleep and she didn't want to wake me. I stoked the fire and put more wood on it because the night was cold. I sat across from her. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Why did you do it, at the fort?" I thought about the honest answer, not the simple one, not the modest one, the honest one. I said, because I was able to, because there wasn't anyone else there who was going to. She looked at the fire. She said, "Men are usually able to do something. They mostly decide not to." I said, "I know. So why you?" I was quiet for a bit. Then I said, "I spent a long time doing work that didn't matter much to anything except the man paying me. I'm not saying that was wrong. It kept me fed and it kept me moving, and moving's not nothing. But I got to a point where I wondered if I was going to get to the end of my road and not have a single thing behind me that was worth the trouble. And I stopped. That felt like a bad way to end up." She was watching me. I said, "You needed someone to stand there and be a wall. I can do that. I'm good at that, so I did it." Nell was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that I thought she'd gone back to what was in her own head, and I should leave her to it. Then she said, "You're a better man than you're letting on, Mr. Calloway." I said, "Drew, you can call me Drew." She said, "Drew," like she was testing the sound of it. We sat by that fire another hour, not saying much, and it was one of the most comfortable hours I can remember. Not because anything was resolved. Nothing was resolved. She was 2 days from a place she'd never been, carrying a child alone, and I had a contract to finish and a life of my own to figure out. Nothing was tidy, but we sat there and the fire was warm and the horses were quiet on the line, and it was enough. The Milk River settlement was called Hargett then, named for a man who'd staked the first claim there. It wasn't big. Maybe 60 people, a general store, a smithy, a doctor who'd been an army surgeon and still had the manner of one. Efficient, dry, not interested in your opinion of the procedure. His name was Fullstrom, and when I brought Nell in and told him she was close to her time and had been traveling hard for a month, he looked her over with that dry efficiency and said she was fine, the baby was fine, and she should rest and stop making the baby worry, which was not the kind of thing doctors usually said, but it made Nell laugh, a real laugh, sudden and surprised, and I liked Fullstrom for it immediately. I delivered my horses. I got paid. I had money in my pocket and no place to be for 6 weeks, which was the time before my next contract took me east again. I should have gone south. I had friends south, a ranch I could spend time at, whiskey I knew and country I knew. That was the sensible thing. I didn't do the sensible thing. I rented a room above the store and I went to work around the settlement, doing what men who are good with their hands do when they find a settlement that needs them. I fixed a roof. I helped build a new stable section. I repaired 3 wagons in 2 weeks. I wasn't doing it to be paid, though people paid me anyway. I was doing it because I didn't want to be 40 miles away when Nell's time came. The truth, if I'm going to be honest about it, was simpler and harder than that. I didn't want to leave. Not the settlement. I'd left dozens of settlements without a second thought. I didn't want to leave the particular gravity of this place, which was not the place at all, but a woman in Marta Hank's house who was waiting for something I didn't yet know how to name. I knew it wasn't my place to want that. I knew what she'd been through. I knew the last thing she needed was another man arriving with intentions and expectations. So I fixed wagons and replaced roof boards and said nothing, and I visited every 2 or 3 days with firewood and supplies, and I kept my voice level and my manner easy, and I gave her every opening to tell me she was fine and I could go. She never took the opening. She was staying at the home of a woman named Marta Hank, who'd come from Germany 10 years earlier and had a directness of manner that reminded me of Nell, and who had taken Nell in with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who knows a person in need when they see one. I visited every 2 or 3 days. Brought things, supplies from the store, firewood, nothing that would raise questions or obligations. I told myself I was just checking in, making sure she was settled. On the 4th visit, Marta opened the door and looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "You can come in and sit down like a person, you know. You don't have to stand on the step handing things through the door. I came in and sat down. Nell was at the table mending something, one of the shirts I'd lent her for the journey, which she was now returning to a shape it hadn't been in when I'd given it. She looked up when I came in and said, "Drew," like she'd been expecting me. I sat down and Marta made coffee and we talked, the three of us, about small things. About Hargett and the coming winter, and whether the doctor was really as contrary as he seemed or whether that was just his face. Nell had a way of talking, considered, dry, occasionally pointed, that made me want to hear what she thought about everything. She was funny when she wanted to be, the kind of funny that comes from someone who has looked at hard things and is not going to pretend otherwise, but is also not going to be defeated by them. I went home that night and lay on the board bed above the store and listened to the cold wind off the plains and thought about a woman I had no right to think about. The baby came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after we arrived. I was in the stable when Marta found me. She was brisk about it, just said it was happening, and the doctor was already there, and there was nothing for me to do, which last part was delivered in a tone that suggested she knew I was going to have trouble with it. She was right, I had trouble with it. I worked in the stable until I couldn't work anymore, and then I walked up and down the frozen yard outside the store until my boots were muddy from where the frost had lifted, and then I sat on the step and waited. Fullstrom came out after a while and said, "Girl, 7 pounds give or take, Nell is well." I said, "Good." He looked at me for a moment, that flat, efficient look he had. He said, "You going to go in and see them?" I said I didn't want to intrude. He said, "She's been asking for you for an hour." He paused. "I thought you should know that." I went in. Nell was in the bed, pale and wrung out the way a person is when they've done the hardest work a body can do, and the baby was on her chest, a small, dark-haired, astonishing creature about the size of nothing at all, with her eyes closed and her hands curled up beside her face. Marta was standing at the back of the room, arms crossed, watching with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has seen this before and knows it for what it is. I stood in the doorway because I didn't know what I was supposed to do with myself. Nell looked up at me. She said, "Come here, Drew." I went to the side of the bed and I stood there and I looked at the baby, who had her mother's dark hair and her mother's quality of, there's no other word, steadiness, even brand new, even in that first hour. Already she looked like she had opinions. I said, "What's her name?" Nell said, "I haven't decided yet." A pause. Then, "I was thinking about names that mean something, not just pretty ones." She was looking at the baby, but something in her voice had changed, gotten careful. "I was thinking about the name of a person who stood between me and every bad thing on the trail." I didn't say anything. My throat had gone peculiar. She looked up at me then. Her eyes were exhausted and entirely clear at the same time, which is something that happens to people after extremity of one kind or another. The fatigue strips everything away, and what's left is just the true thing. She said, "I want to tell you something, and I'm going to say it plain because I don't know how to say it any other way. You are the only man who has ever stood in front of me without wanting something back. You carried me across that country and you put your body between me and 3 men on a ridge, and you never asked me to be anything except who I was. I know you think you did it because you were able to, but I've been around a lot of men who were able to and chose not to. You chose. That matters to me. You matter to me." She held out her hand, not asking for anything, just making it available. I took it, stood there with her hand in mine and the baby on her chest and Marta quietly looking at nothing in particular at the back of the room, and I felt the weight of it, that same weight I'd felt on the trail, the having to answer for weight, the accountability weight, and this time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an anchor, like the thing that keeps a man from drifting past his own life without noticing. I said, "I'd like to stay." She said, "Then stay." Simple as that, not a performance, not a declaration, just the truth landing between two people who'd earned the right to say it plain. I want to tell you about the weeks after that, because this isn't a story that goes straight from one moment to the rest of the life without all the ordinary in between. There was a lot of ordinary. That's mostly what I want to tell you about. I moved from the room above the store. There was a small house at the edge of the settlement, 2 rooms, solid walls, a south-facing window that in winter got what sun there was, and I put in a month of hard work on it, repairing the chimney and rechinking the walls and building a proper door to replace the one that had warped off its hinges. I put in a cook stove. I got it right, is what I'm saying. I got it proper. I want to say something about that month of work, because it was different from every other job I'd done in my life. I'd worked hard before. I'd worked harder than most men I knew, because the kind of life I'd led required it, long hours in bad weather on difficult country, working horses that didn't want to be worked and hauling freight that didn't want to be hauled. I knew how to put in a day. But that work had always been for someone else's account, toward someone else's result. The money was mine, but the thing built was not. You finish a contract, and you ride away, and the horses you delivered become somebody else's horses, and the route you traveled becomes somebody else's route, and you are no more than a man who passed through. This was different. Every nail I drove into that chimney frame was going to hold somebody's warmth. Every length of chinking I pressed into those wall joints was going to keep out a wind that would otherwise reach the people sleeping on the other side of it. The cook stove I set level and plumbed true was going to heat water and food for a woman and a child for years after I was gone, and I was not planning to be gone, which was the thing that made all the difference. I was building toward my own life. That's a different kind of effort. Your hands work different when you know you're going to have to sleep in what you built. Prentice came by one afternoon and watched me work for a while and then said, "You're doing this like a man building a church." I said I was doing it like a man building a house. He looked at the wall I'd been chinking and said, "That's what I mean." I didn't answer him, but I understood what he was saying. He was saying it showed, that the intention showed in the work. I thought about that all afternoon while I finished the chinking, and I decided it was all right for it to show. I had intentions. I was not ashamed of them. Nell came to see it when the work was done. She walked through both rooms, looked at the window, put her hand on the cook stove. She didn't say anything for a minute. Then she said, "This is a good house." I said, "It's yours if you want it." She turned and looked at me. Her eyes had that same quality they'd had in the bed after the birth, clear down to the bottom. She said, "I want it if you're in it." That was the conversation. That was all of it. The baby's name was Drusilla. Nell decided it the next morning and told me at breakfast like it was already a settled fact, which it was. She'd named her baby after me, in the plain way she did everything, because she wanted to and there wasn't a reason not to. I didn't say much about that. I couldn't say much about that. There's a kind of thing that happens when a person honors you in a way you never expected to be honored, and you can either talk it into the ordinary or you can be quiet and let it be what it is. I chose quiet. I should tell you that winter was hard. The freeze came early the first week of November, and it came with intention. The kind of cold that gets into the walls and stays. We burned through wood faster than I'd planned, and I spent 2 weeks in December cutting more, which Nell told me was unnecessary, and then helped me stack because she had decided it was necessary after all. She was like that. She'd tell you something was fine and then roll up her sleeves and fix it. She fed the baby and she kept the house, and she made meals out of what we had that were always better than they had any right to be. And she told me what she thought about things without softening it, and she laughed at things that were actually funny instead of things that were just supposed to be. And she argued with me twice. Real arguments, with position and counterposition, the kind two people have when they both have opinions and think the other person is wrong. And won one of them and lost one of them and was gracious about both. I came in from the cold one night in January, ice on my beard, hands so stiff I couldn't get my coat buttons right, and she came and did them for me, not making a thing of it, just standing there unhooking my buttons the way you do with something that needs doing, and I looked down at the top of her head and thought, I am the luckiest man on the Milk River. I am possibly the luckiest man in the Northern Territories, not because I had deserved this. Because I'd had a roan mare throw a shoe at the wrong time and turned left instead of right, and ended up somewhere I hadn't meant to be. And then I'd done the thing in front of me and kept doing the next thing in front of me, and this was where it had led. She looked up and caught me looking. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing. Just looking." She went back to the buttons. She said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere, Drew." Like she'd read what was in me. Like she knew the particular place a man who's been alone a long time keeps hidden, the one that doesn't quite believe good things are permanent. She said it again, even quieter, "I'm not going anywhere." I put my hand on her hair. She let me. That's all it was, just that. We were married in March, when the first thaw came and the mud was 2 inches deep, and Fulstrom pronounced himself available as a witness before going back to whatever it was he was always going back to. There was no ceremony to speak of. Marta was there, and two men from the settlement whose names were Prentice and Doak, who had become something like friends over the winter, and that was everyone. The words were said and they were meant, which is the only part that matters. Nell wore a blue dress that Marta had made her, because she hadn't had anything to wear that fit right since Kansas. The dress was good. She was better. She stood beside me and looked forward while the words were said, and when it was done, she took my hand and held it the way she'd held it in the bedroom the day after the birth, not asking for anything, just holding it. Prentice and Doak and Marta stayed for supper, and we sat around the table in that south-facing room with Drusilla asleep in her box near the stove, and the last of the winter dark pressed against the window. And we ate and talked and laughed at things that were actually funny, and it was, I don't know another word for it, it was right. When they'd gone home and the fire was low and Drusilla was still asleep, Nell washed the plates and I dried them and put them away, and there was nothing that needed to be said. We'd said it. It was done and it was good. I put my arm around her there by the wash basin and she leaned into me, her head against my shoulder, just for a moment, just the length of a breath, and it was the most honored I have ever felt. Not because of the vows, not because of the day. Because she was a woman who had been given every reason to trust nothing and no one, and she had chosen, freely, without being soft about it or sentimental about it, to lean into me. That's what I carry. I've been telling this story to my boy, my and Nell's boy, who came along the next year, and who I'll get to in a moment, and he always wants to know what happened to Ordell. What happened to Griggs and Burchard and Delacroix? I'll tell you what I know. Ordell ran his operation at Coulter's Fort for 2 more years. He came to a bad end that I didn't arrange, which is something I'm neither proud nor sorry about. The arrangement of his bad end was between him and other men with other grievances. I heard about it secondhand in a settlement south of the river, the winter after we married. Burchard I never heard of again. He was a man the world had too many of and would not miss. Delacroix, Nell told me, had gone to California. She told me this with the flat certainty of someone who has decided a chapter is closed. I felt about it what she felt about it, nothing useful, nothing productive. He wasn't worth the years it would take off a man's life to hate him properly. Griggs, the heavyset man with the bent-brim cavalry hat who'd counted $30 on that table, Griggs I actually saw again, 2 years later. He came through Hargett on the trail, and I was outside the smithy when he rode past. He looked at me and I could see him work to place me, and then he placed me, and his face went careful. I looked at him without anything particular in my face. He rode on. That was the end of it. My boy is named James. He is a serious child who asks questions about everything and argues about the answers, which is how I know he's his mother's. He is 7 now, and he already has opinions about horses that are better informed than most men's, which I'll take credit for. Drusilla is 8, and she has an entirely different quality. Quick, certain. The kind of girl who decides things and then does them. Who already at 8 has that same upright character her mother carried across the plains in a carpet bag she wouldn't let go of. When people in the settlement see Drusilla, they say she looks like Nell, and she does, which is the best thing she could look like. When I look at my family, which I do with some regularity, because I am not a fool about what I have, I think about the thrown shoe. Cress's thrown shoe, 2 days west of Coulter's Fort, that sent me left instead of right. I think about how a life can turn on the smallest mechanical failure. A nail in a hoof, $40 on a table. One man who happened to be standing in a yard at the right moment who could have kept walking and didn't. I didn't do anything I shouldn't have done, that's the plain truth. I did the thing in front of me and then the next thing and the next after that. I didn't rescue Nell Vass. She didn't need rescuing, not in the way that word usually means, like there was something broken in her that needed fixing. She needed a wall, and I was a wall, and then she chose to stay on this side of it. That was her decision, made freely, with full knowledge of what I was and what I wasn't. She chose me. There is not a single day of my life, since that, I have not been aware of what that is worth. Not a single day. I want to leave you with one last thing, not an ending exactly, just a thing that happened last September that I keep coming back to. We were out on the far pasture. I've got a small spread now, 9 horses plus a working pair, more than I've ever owned, and Nell had ridden out with me to check the fence line on the east side. which a wet summer had heaved in a couple of places. Drusilla was in school. James was with Marta, which was his preference on school days since Marta fed him better. It was late afternoon. That particular September light that does what it does out on the plains, low and gold, everything gone amber and sharp-edged, the grass moving just enough to show you which direction the wind was coming from. Nell had gotten off her horse to look at one of the posts, which had gone soft at the base and would need to be replaced before winter. She straightened up and pushed her hair back from her face, the way she does, and she looked out over the pasture for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "This is a good life, Drew." I said it was. She said, "I want you to know that I know that I don't take it as ordinary." She paused. "That I know exactly who gave it to me." I got down off my horse and I stood beside her at that fence line, and she put her arm through mine, and we stood there while the light went from gold to orange, and the horses grazed behind us and the grass moved in its quiet way. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. That woman had carried herself across the worst country a man could find himself in, carrying her child and her dignity intact, and she'd decided freely, with her eyes open, that this life and this man were what she wanted. She'd said so plain more than once, not with sentimentality, not with performance. Just plain. I put my hand over hers where it rested on my arm, and we stood there until the orange went to rose and the first stars appeared over the eastern ridge, enormous and too many to count. Just like they'd been that first night, when she'd finally slept and I'd sat up alone and wondered if I was equal to what I'd taken on. I was, it turned out I was. Not because I'd been something special. Because I'd been present and steady and willing to be the wall when a wall was needed. And a woman of uncommon quality had seen that and named it for what it was and chosen it. She was still choosing. Every morning I woke up in that house and heard her in the kitchen and heard the children and heard the horses in the yard. She was still choosing. I am 61 years old as I tell you this, and I have been a horseman and a drifter and a man with a contract to fill and nothing behind me. And I have been a husband and a father and a man whose name a little girl carries forward into the world, and I know which of those I am proud of. I know what I was, and I know what I am, and I know who gave me the second. Her name is Nell Calloway, and she is inside right now, and I am going in.